Akbar with a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajah.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجه. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين، واللعنة الدائم على أعدائهم أجمعين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. لقد تاب الله على النبي والمهاجرين والأنصار الذين اتبعوه في ساعة العسرة من بعد ما كاد يزيغ قلوب فريق منهم ثم تاب عليهم ليتوبوا. إن الله هو التواب الرحيم، إنه بهم رؤوف رحيم. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a second loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. For the hastening in the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Yesterday we ended our discussion on the conquest of the city of Mecca. This was a great and a wonderful development in the chapter of the life of the Prophet, because once you take over Mecca, and once Mecca comes under the authority of the Muslims, it almost seems as though most of the Arabian Peninsula has now been unified under the flag and the authority and the banner of Islam. And we explained the steps that the Prophet took to make this a reality, and how the Prophet was able to take over Mecca with the least bloodshed possible. Hundreds of people, maybe 1,000 people living in Mecca, and out of all of those, it seems as though none of them came to fight against the army of the Prophet. And that was because of the strategic way that the Prophet approached this issue. That he had his army march in front of him, and he had Abu Sufyan see what his army is carrying, to the extent that the narration said Abu Sufyan went into the city himself and told people where they have to go in order to stay immune from the army of the Prophet. And this was the Prophet's plan, to reduce the bloodshed that was going to take place in Mecca. And so out of these hundreds or thousands of individuals, you found that maybe 10 or 15 only were those that the Prophet did not spare. And each one of them, when you look into their lives, it has its own reason. And historians have talked about why this person, the Prophet, didn't spare his life, and why this person did not spare his life. And as the narrations say, the Prophet said about some of them, He said, even if they are holding on to the curtains of the Kaaba, they are not to be spared. And this shows that when the Prophet made these decrees and these decisions, they weren't based on emotions. It wasn't because he liked this person or didn't like that person. It was because this person had either already killed Muslims before, or it was a person who had played a role in other Muslims being killed. And who were these 15 individuals? And what were their stories is a long discussion, and we don't have time to go into that. Until the Prophet made his way into the city of Mecca, and all of Quraysh was waiting to see what the Prophet would decide about them. And he said to them exactly what Yusuf had said to his own brothers. لا تثريب عليكم اليوم يغفر الله لكم وهو أرحم الراحمين. There's no blame upon you today. Allah will forgive you, and He is the most merciful of all. And just like that, this city that was the very focal point of the torture, was the focal point of the annoyance, it was the focal point of the bothering for the Muslim Ummah, then turned into a base for the Muslim Ummah. It is only someone like the Prophet who can take a negative situation like this and turn it into a positive situation. This Mecca that was so full of evil individuals now became a place where it was part of this Muslim Ummah. This is where we ended our discussion, and we mentioned that the Prophet then started to make his way back towards Medina, and this was because the people of Medina, the Ansar, were now starting to get worried. Is the Prophet now going to stay in his hometown, or is he going to come back with us? And we said the lesson to be learned from this is that the character of the Prophet shined so bright that the people of Medina just wanted him to be there with him. And they were so worried that what if the Prophet has his emotions come back to him again? His hometown, the place where he lived with Khadija, the place where he lived with Abu Talib, what if he decides to stay in Mecca? And we said that this shows the character of the Prophet and the greatness of who he was. This is where we ended our discussion. This was the 8th year after Hijrah. Tonight, inshallah, we'll continue with the discussion, delving into another chapter of the life of the Prophet, and that is the Battle of Tabuk and the Year of Delegations, this famous battle that is going to take place, as well as the time where now all of the delegations from the different parts of this Arabian Peninsula are going to come and join the Ummah of the Prophet. And in each of these events, there are a multitude of lessons that we can walk away with. And in order to delve into the topic, we're going to pose the following questions. Number one, what made the Battle of Tabuk such a difficult battle for the Muslims? What were the obstacles that you found in this battle that were not there in any of the other battles of the Prophet? Number two, what was the name of the man who, when the Prophet had called his army to come and join him and set out towards Tabuk, initially he rejected the Prophet. Initially he came up with an excuse, but then when he went home and sat in the comfort of his house, the guilt that he had in his heart got the best of him and made the right decision at the final moment and finally joined the army of the Prophet. Number three, why were some of the companions of the Prophet crying when the Prophet told them that they would not be able to join him in the Battle of Tabuk? Number four, what results came out of the Battle of Tabuk and how did it benefit the Muslim Ummah? And number five, and finally, what conditions did the delegation of Thakif put in front of the Prophet? And how did the Prophet respond to these conditions? And what lessons can you and I learn from how the Prophet responded to the negotiations and the conditions that they had set forth? Tonight, inshallah, we'll delve into these 5 questions with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. The salawat doesn't sound like a salawat on the night of Eid. Another salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Don't worry, tonight's the last night. We're not going to take your time anymore after this. So inshallah, hopefully that brings you some more happiness. All right, let's begin from here. The Battle of Tabuk was significant and it was unique because of this following reason. Tabuk was an area that was very close. It was between the line between Syria and the Arabian Peninsula, or essentially the line between where the Muslim Ummah had grown to and where the Roman Empire now began. And the Prophet got news that the Roman Empire is now putting together an army to come and attack. Now, to put this into context, this is not Quraysh anymore. This is not Mecca or Ta'if or these small little places here and there. This is the Byzantine Empire. This is the empire when they come. You know, they say Rome wasn't built in one day. This is that empire is coming now. And the narration says the munafiqun in Medina, the hypocrites in Medina, when they heard that the army is coming, they got very happy because they sat there and they said, you know what? Muhammad really got in trouble now. He's in serious trouble now. Before it was Quraysh, this tribe, that tribe, okay, maybe he can pull it off. But the munafiqun used to say, they said, it's almost as if we can see that the people of Rome have come, they've killed Muhammad and all of his army. It's like, this is like clear as day to them. And because of this, when the Prophet got the news that the Roman army is approaching, he had to put together an army to move to that area. But this trip and this journey was not a small journey to Uhud. It was not a small journey to Badr. These were outside of Medina. They were close. This was a journey that would take days and maybe even months to go on. Very far away. And so the Prophet started to put together this army. And unlike the conquest of Mecca, where things were done in a secretive, strategic manner, this time the Prophet announced it publicly. The reason for this is because the Roman Empire was sending their army. He wanted to make it clear to them that there was going to be resistance, that they couldn't just come into the Muslim Ummah, come and do whatever they want to do. And so he announced publicly, and he wrote to all of the other tribes who were allies of his, and at this point there were many after the conquest of Mecca, that they all have to join, they all have to come together to start to set out towards this battle of Tabuk. The problem though was Tabuk was not close. It was very far away. And this journey, just looking at it on paper, you knew immediately this journey was going to be an extremely difficult journey. There was going to be wind that you had to deal with. There was going to be sandstorms you had to deal with. There was going to be thirst that you had to deal with. The heat of Arabia you had to deal with. These were no jokes. And so because of this, when the Prophet announced that he is now putting his army together, the people who reacted to the Prophet were a number of different categories. And you and I can ask ourselves, by the way, which category do we fall under? There's a number of categories we're going to explain. You and I will see which categories we'll fall under. 3 to 4 different categories. The first category was those who in this trip, when they heard the call of the Prophet, immediately they responded to him. And the Quran speaks about them. The Quran says they were those of the believers in Sa'atul Usra, in the most difficult of times, they responded to the call of the Prophet. This is group number 1. And they weren't small in numbers. There were a lot in numbers. So when the Prophet put his army together, they say around 30,000. This is big for the Prophet's numbers, yes? But that's because almost all of this Arabian Peninsula now is coming together. There's still tribes who aren't Muslim. But so many of them at this point have joined. It's a big number. This is the first group. Prophet said, I need your help. I need your assistance. And they came. This was number 1. Then there was a second group. Prophet, when he asked them for help, they came up with excuses. And each of them came up with their own excuses. Some of them said, you know, right now is the time to harvest our crops, our trees, our plants, because Medina was a place where you had gardens and farms and so on and so forth. They said, now we can't come. And the other one came up with another excuse. And the other one came up with another excuse. This is the second category. People who had an excuse, but their excuse was not valid. Just a fake excuse. Now pay attention to these categories we're making, because there's an important lesson to be learned from it. This is a delicate categorization that we're doing here. Then there was a third group. There was a third group who had excuses, but their excuses were valid. There were women, there were children, some of them were ill, they couldn't come on this journey. And some of them, they wanted to come on this journey, but they didn't have anything to ride on the way. They didn't have a horse, they couldn't afford a camel, they didn't have anything to come with. And so you had these 3 different categories. The first category who outright went with the Prophet. The second category who had an excuse and the excuse was valid. The third category who came up with excuses, but their excuses were not valid. And this third category were also 2 groups. Some of them, they came up with excuses that weren't valid, and deep down they had an animosity towards the Prophet. They were munafiq. They were hypocrite. And pay attention to this. This is an important lesson for you and I. And then also there were those who came up with an excuse, and their excuse wasn't valid, but they didn't have animosity. It was just that their faith was weak. His faith was weak. So he thought to himself, if I can come up with an excuse, I don't have to go with the Prophet. Now, is he a person who hates Islam and all of this kind of stuff? Is he wishing for the Prophet to get killed over there? No. But he has this excuse. He's like, you know what? If there's a way I can get away, There's a way I don't have to deal with this. So 3 or 4 different categories. And the question you want to have to ask ourselves is, which category do we fall under? Which category do we fall under? Do we fall under that category when they say come, we rush and we run? Do we fall under that category who comes up with excuses and our excuses are not valid? And are we a part of those whose faith is just weak? And what happens to them? And how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deal with that group of people? These were the different categories that took place, yes? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks highly of the ones who joined the Prophet, because this was a difficult trip and a difficult battle. That's why the battle was called, on one hand, the Battle of Tabuk. On the other hand, it was called the Battle of Usra, the Battle of Difficulty. Because just for you to get from Medina to where you needed to get to then confront the Roman Empire and the Roman army, there were so many obstacles you had to deal with that just getting to that point, you had to be really disciplined. You had to really be willing to go with the army of the prophets. And each of these categories, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala separates them. In Islam, there is never a generalization of how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at a group of people. He will look at a group of people, each one of them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at them in a different light. One of them, He looks upon them, He says in His heart, he's the one who would obey quickly. This one is the one who would disobey. This one is the one who will come up with an excuse, but that's just because his faith is weak, not because he has animosity. This is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees us. We look at each other and we look at people in society, we say it's just one society. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sets apart every person. Everyone has their own hisab in His eyes. Okay, the Prophet now puts together this army. Abdullah ibn Ubay stayed in Medina. He said, Bani al-Asfar, the yellow people. This is a terminology they used to use in Arabic. They used to refer to the Romans as al-Asfar, the yellow ones, the blonde ones. This is what they used to refer to them. And when they wanted to say, everybody, they say Asfar wal Ahmar wal Aswad. The red and the yellow and the black, and this means all of mankind, all the ethnicities. This is just terminology that they used to use, yes? They used to say, we see that Bani al-Asfar will come, they will kill Muhammad and all of his army. These are the different categories that you have. And the munafiqeen started to walk around in the city of Medina. They used to go around to those people who were actually willing to go. And they used to say, listen, the weather is going to be really hot. This is no joke. And you might reach a point where there may not be much water. And the Quran speaks about them. He says they used to go around, they used to say, La tanfiru fil har. Don't go on this journey in the heat of Arabia. And you know what the Quran says to them? The Quran says, قُلْ نَارُ جَهَنَّمَ أَشَدُّ حَرًّا. The Quran tells the munafiqeen, He says, you know what's hotter than the heat in Arabia? Hellfire is hotter than the heat in Arabia. You keep going around telling these folks not to go. You don't understand. The heat of Arabia, you may not have to deal with it. You'll have to deal with something much worse than it. You can't be going around and weakening the faith of those who are actually willing to go. This army starts to head out slowly. Now each of these categories, they come and they approach the Prophet. Amongst those who had valid excuses were a group of people, 7, 8 of the Ansar. They were not that rich. They were not that wealthy. The narration says they came to the Prophet. They said, Ya Rasulullah, we want to come with you, but we have a problem. So what's the problem? They said, we don't have anything to ride on. We don't have a camel, we don't have a mule, a donkey, any of this kind of stuff to ride on and come with you. You, Ya Rasulullah, do you have anything that you can give to us? Can you help us with something? And though most of the army had stuff to ride on, the Prophet looked in his army and said, all of our wealth has been taken up. I don't have anything to give to you. And then the Quran says this, so beautiful. The Quran says, when the Prophet said this, look at this faith. When the Prophet said, you can't come with me because I don't have anything that you are able to ride on. It says, تَوَلَّوْا. They turned away from the Prophet. وَأَعْيُنُهُمْ تَفِيضُ مِنَ الدَّمْعِ. And their eyes were full of tears. They wanted to be there for the Prophet so badly that when the Prophet said, I don't have anything to give to you so that you come on this journey with me, they started to cry. And then the narration says, at the end of the battle, when everything had settled down, when the Prophet was coming back to Medina, he turned to his people. He said, some of us, they were not able to join us in this battle, but every step that we took, they were rewarded for this as well. And the people said, وَهُمْ بِالْمَدِينَةِ. They're still in Medina and you're saying this? There were folks in Medina, they were rewarded to come on this journey with us. And the Prophet said, yes, because they had the intention to come with us. They had the niyyah to come with us. The Prophet starts to put together his army. He is going to set behind or leave behind a representative for him. Because this journey is different from any other journey where the other journeys were closer to Medina, the Prophet felt and sensed a severe danger for Medina. Because now he's going to go. He's not going to be missing for a day or two. He's going to be missing for tens of days. So the narration says he called out all of his army, except for who? Except the one who always came to the battles. Except the one who always used to take care of the flag bearers on the other side. Except the one who would change the tune in every battle. And that was none but Ali ibn Abi Talib. And he told Ali, you have to stay here. You have to stay and you have to be in charge of Medina. As the Prophet was gathering outside, munafiqun in Medina, and some say it was because out of their fear and their frustration, that they knew that now that Ali is in charge, we can't really do anything with Medina anymore. Because their plan was once the Prophet left, we do something here. Their plan was, let's start some rumors going. And the rumor was this. You know, the Prophet doesn't really like Ali. That's why he left him behind. He left him behind because he wanted to take everybody else. But you know, Ali, he's not strong enough. He's not powerful enough. He's not much of a help. And so the narration says before the Prophet had actually left Medina, Ali ibn Abi Talib caught up with him and said, Ya Rasulullah, this is what people are saying in Medina. And of course, Ali ibn Abi Talib knows that these things are not true, but he wants the Prophet to speak to this issue. And the Prophet turned to him and he said, Ya Ali, wouldn't you want to be أَمَا تَرْضَى أَن تَكُونَ مِنِّي بِمَنْزِلَةِ هَارُونَ مِن مُوسَى? Don't you want to be and have the status that Harun had compared to Musa? Don't you want to have that status compared to me? Don't you want your relationship with me to be like the relationship that Harun had with Musa? What did Harun do with Musa, or Musa did with Harun? When Musa was leaving for the mountain, he told Harun to stay back there. And he said, Ya Ali, that is the relationship that we have. Illa, except, only difference. Illa annahu la nabiyya ba'di. Except that Harun was a prophet, you're not a prophet. That's the only difference. And this one short line that the Prophet said, and this wasn't the only time that the Prophet said this. He said it on multiple occasions. This one line has many theological implications. Because what role did Harun play for Musa? When Musa was asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he said, Oh Allah, give me someone who is a sharik in this mission. وَأَشْرِكْهُ فِي أَمْرِي. What does that say about the status of Ali ibn Abi Talib? What role did Ali ibn Abi Talib have? Was he just a companion of the Prophet? Or was he sharik in the mission of the prophets? And who else was given this status? And this one line is the line that you find even the most conservative, hardcore in other schools of thought, they will agree that the Prophet said this line. Even the Ibn Taymiyyahs of the world will agree that the Prophet said this line. This had many theological implications. As the Prophet is heading out, the munafiqun also came to the Prophet. They say, Ya Rasulullah, we've built a masjid. Where is this masjid built? In Quba. Quba, if you remember, outskirts of Medina. They say, Ya Rasulullah, we built this masjid. The Prophet said, why you built this masjid? We already have Masjid al-Quba there. He said, no, we built this masjid because there are some who can't come to Masjid al-Quba. But in reality, the munafiqun were using this area for their own plots and plans. This was their headquarters. And in order to have cover, they used it as a masjid. So they were going to come, pray here, we're going to do all of this stuff. And look at their strategy. They say, Ya Rasulullah, we also need you to come and pray here. We need you to come and do your salat here. And the Prophet said, right now, I'm on my way towards Tabuk. I can't come right now. Maybe on the way back. Right now, I don't have the ability to do that. They said, no problem, Ya Rasulullah. On your way back. But you have to come. Masjid, blessed. You have to come. You have to do this here. The Prophet said, maybe. I'll leave it until after the battle. Now I'm fast forwarding a little bit. When the Prophet came back, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent him revelation. He said, no, this masjid is Masjidul Dhirar. It's a masjid where the ummah of the Prophet is being hurt. The ummah of the Prophet is not benefiting from this. And this was a big thing because it was a masjid. This is the type of stuff that only the Prophet and Ali ibn Abi Talib can make, judgments. This is big judgments. He said, this is Masjid al-Dhirar. And when the Prophet came back, because he had received this revelation and he knew munafiqeen were using this area as his headquarters, He said, I am not going to pray here, and in fact, you have to ruin it. This is unbelievable for you and I. And this goes to show, even the holiest things in our religion can potentially be misused. Even the holiest things in Islam. Sometimes people say, Sheikh, this person, he has a religious appearance and all this stuff, but his akhlaq is like this. I say, yes, religious appearance, people use it for the wrong reasons. Yes, people can act one way and then do another thing. Yes, you can have the longest salat and then your salat is riyah. It's possible. But just because there are people who misuse this religion, that is not to hold you and I from practicing this religion. Sometimes people say, well, there's so many of these people, they have this religious appearance, but they don't really practice it. Okay, bismillah, they're not doing the right thing. Why don't you go ahead and do the right thing? Why don't I go ahead and do the right thing? Let me have a religious appearance and have good akhlaq. Why does it have to be one or the other? Why does it have to be, I have to be outwardly practicing of the religion or have good akhlaq? Who said it has to be like that? There's a lot of people who have outward religious appearance, but they don't have the insides of the religion. There's a lot of people who have good akhlaq and they don't abide by the rulings of Islam in their day-to-day life. And Islam doesn't want either of these. Islam wants both. Islam wants you to be the one who does his 5-day prayers and then has the best akhlaq. Islam wants you to be the one who goes by the detailed rulings of Islam and at the same time trusts people and deals with people in a fair way. Why does it have to be this or that? Oh, because people misuse this religion. Of course. This is during the time of the Prophet. A masjid that is the holiest of places is being misused. It's being misused to an extent that the Prophet said you have to ruin this masjid. I mean, even when I say this, it's difficult to even say these words that you're talking about a masjid. But the Prophet is telling us, even a masjid, the holiest of things in Islam, the best of rulings, the best of religions, it can be misused. But when it's misused, does that give you and I an excuse to walk away from the faith? Does that give you and I an excuse to say, oh, look, they misuse it, so I'm not drawn to this religion? You see, some people misuse it. Yes, there is a lot of people who misuse it. This is while the Prophet is still alive and people are misusing it. This is a big lesson for us to learn. Recite a salawat, please. The Prophet, he heads out of Medina. And the people who are left in Medina at this point are two categories. Either they had a reason to stay, they were ill, they were sick, they were not strong enough to come, they had nothing to ride on, great. Or they are people who disobeyed the command of the Prophet. But even in this group who disobeyed the command of the Prophet, not everyone is the same. Because a group of them are munafiq, they have issues. A group of them, their faith is weak. And one of these individuals whose faith was weak was an individual by the name of Abu Khaythama. Take a look at the story of Abu Khaythama. You and I might be Abu Khaythama. Right? Maybe myself. Maybe not you guys. Maybe myself. Abu Khaythama says, I came home and the Prophet left. And when the Prophet left, I was so happy that, you know what? I don't have to deal with all of this headache. I can just go back to Madina. I can do my business work. I can harvest my crops. I can take care of my life. He says, I went back home. And when I went back home, I saw my wife had prepared food for me. And she had this shade going. And she had a good drink for me. You know, all the comforts of life. He said, I came and I sat under the shade of this grapevine. And I was just like, this is so comfortable. And then he says, Abu Khaythama, as he was sitting there under the comfort of his own house, he thought to himself, he said, my own brothers and sisters right now, they're where? They're in the middle of nowhere. They're making their way towards this area called Tabuk because the attack is coming. And the more he thought about it, the more guilt started to build up inside of him. And it reached a point and he said, you know what? I can't enjoy my life like this. I can't sit here in the shade knowing that the Prophet needed my help and I wasn't willing to go. And the narration says he turned to his wife and he said, you all need to prepare because I'm leaving. They said, you're leaving? You came here to rest. You told the Prophet you're not going to go. He said, yes, but I've changed my mind now. This is the 11th hour. This is the last minutes. This is, in our context, the last day of Ramadan. Last moment, Abu Khaythama, he said, yes, but I feel so guilty because the Prophet is on this journey. I'm not there with him. And Abu Khaythama, what did he do? In the last minutes, he got up and he said, I'm going to go and join the army. And the army was already on his way. But you know, the army is 30,000 strong. It's going slower. Abu Khaythama rushed. And he finally caught up with the Prophet. And the Prophet saw him. And the moment he saw him, he forgave him. And he accepted his tawbah. And maybe you and I are Abu Khaythama. Maybe this whole Ramadan, I haven't done what I was supposed to do. Maybe there was an apology I was supposed to give to someone. I haven't given that apology. Maybe there was something I had to give back to somebody. I haven't given it back to them. Maybe there was something I was to do to repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I haven't done that. But guess what? Today's the last day of Ramadan. Maybe you and I are Abu Khaythama, and in that 11th hour, we make the right decision. And Abu Khaythama's story was so powerful that it made its way into the Quran. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allah accepted the tawbah of those who came with the Prophet and those who it was close for shaitan to trick them. But in the final moment, they joined the prophets. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees all of this. Some people, they don't start out well. But that last moment, that is why you never give up faith. Not on yourself. You don't give up hope. You never also give up hope on anybody else. This person who's walking, he's disobedient to Allah, he does whatever he wants to do. It's Ramadan, everyone else is in the masjid, this person is in other places, places of sin even. You never know. You never know. Maybe he comes and he passes by you as well. And he goes way beyond you as well. Abu Khaythama, in the final moment, he said, I don't want to be a part of this group. He came, he joined the Prophet, and the moment the Prophet saw him, he accepted his repentance and his tawbah. Recite the salawat, please. The army of the Prophet heads out towards Tabuk, but this is not any normal journey. As he's heading out, slowly the weather gets hotter and hotter. Slowly they start to lose more and more water. Slowly they reach areas that the narration says was the areas where the houses of Thamud were. Thamud, this tribe of Salih. And the Prophet turned to his people and said, learn from the fate of the people of Thamud. Where are they now? They thought they were powerful. Where are they now? And the narration says every step of the way that they went, 20-something stations between where Madina is and where Tabuk is. You can imagine how long this journey is going to be. The narration says as they continued, it became more and more and more difficult. And then there were sandstorms, and the narration says they could not even see ahead of them. The narration says they were covering their faces because there were heat waves that were coming towards them. The wind that was coming was so hot. I don't know if you've seen this before. When you are in areas where the heat is very severe, if you go and then there's wind as well, it's like someone has a blow dryer on your face. That's what it feels like. I lived in Qom. I know exactly what this feels like, right? When you're riding, I had a bike in Qom. When you ride on the bike in Qom, the weather hits you, it feels like they have a blow dryer on your face. This is the type of situation these Muslims were on. They came to this area, they were very short on water. They wanted to take from water in the well. The Prophet told them, no, this is from the water of the well of Thamud. Don't take from this water. And he said, don't even do wudu from this water. What was this water? What effect would it have? We don't know. This was just the command of the Prophet. They finally make their way all the way till the area of Tabuk. When they finally get to the area of Tabuk, the Prophet is standing there and they see nobody has come from the other side. Why? Because the Roman army has heard of this big army that's coming. In reality, their numbers were smaller than the numbers of the Roman army. But because they felt this resistance that's coming from the other side, they changed their decision. And so this battle was a battle where the battling and the fighting never happened in it. But why was that? Why didn't the fighting happen? How come nobody was killed? Because the Muslims, they did what they were supposed to do. They took the steps that they had to take. They didn't sit there and say, oh, well, we'll just, inshallah, it'll be taken care of. We don't have to worry about that. No, they did what they had to do. And because they did what they had to do, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed them. And they didn't even have to deal with the Roman army. And the Prophet got to that area and he went around to the other neighboring tribes. These are tribes that are at the border. They're very important because if later on the army decides to come back, well, these are the first tribes that are going to find out about it. The Prophet went around and signed peace treaties with each of these. And because he himself was there as part of the army, it had its own power and it had its own significance. And he signed these peace treaties, and now the results of the battle became a lot more clear. That these Muslims came all the way, now even the Romans felt the resistance of the Muslims, and now these neighboring tribes at the border are also on the side of the prophets. This was some of the results that came out of the Battle of Tabuk. The Prophet got together with his companions, and he said, we have to decide, do we push further, or do we now go back to Medina? If we push further into Rome, we come back to Medina. And unanimously, they came to the conclusion that we would head back to Medina. Because now they had these neighboring tribes that would support them in case anything else were to happen. Prophet came back to Medina. When he came back to Medina, of course, the people in Medina, like we said, those who had stayed without an excuse were two groups. Some of them had animosity towards the Prophet. Some of them didn't have animosity towards the Prophet. Their faith was weak. They came up with excuses. They wanted to stay to do their business work. They wanted to stay to harvest their crops. Prophet came back. Out of all of the people who had stayed in Medina, the Prophet pinpointed three. He said, these three individuals, no one has the right to speak to them. And he pinpointed these three because these were the three who had faith, but their faith was weak. While the others, they were munafiq. They didn't really believe in this religion. So the Prophet didn't worry about them. So they didn't come? Okay, fine. They didn't come. But these three, they believe in us, except that their faith is weak. And so they have to understand that there are consequences. Now, you have to understand, the Prophet, when he makes a decision like this decision is out of pure love. Because the Quran says that this Prophet, harisun alaykum, he will not let go of you until he brings you to the right path. Azizun alayhi ma anittum, when he sees you going through a hard time, it puts him through difficulty. So he's doing this like a kind father, because he wants to bring these three to the right path. The only way for him to do that is to make things a little difficult for them. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does with us sometimes. Sometimes the difficulties that we go through is because we're on the wrong path and He wants to bring you back. And the compassion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, though it shows itself in the form of punishment and difficulty, in reality it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala trying to get you back on the right path. And you know who else had this and never really got the right message? Fir'aun. Because the Quran says, every time Fir'aun and his people, Musa used to call them, they used to reject. Then what do we do? فَأَرْسَلْنَا عَلَيْهِمُ الطُّوفَانِ وَالْجَرَادِ وَالْقُمَّلَ وَالضَّفَادِعَ وَالدَّمِ. We sent the flood, we sent the frogs, we sent the lice, we sent everything. But Ya Allah, did you send these as punishments for them? The Quran says no. We sent these as ayat. We were trying to get Fir'aun back on the right path. This is Fir'aun. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we're trying to get him back on the right path. And if this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does to get the Fir'auns of the world back on the right path, you can imagine what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will do for you and I to come back on the right path. He will never let go of us. He will never let go of us. And this is why salat is so important, because salat is that thing where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you messed up, okay, you have to come back now. You messed up in the morning, okay, it's dhuhr time, you have to come back. Oh, I messed up 6 p.m. Okay, it's maghrib time. Now you have to come back. Oh, it was nighttime. I messed up. Okay, it's morning time. Fajr, you have to come back. And you and I sit there and say, Ya Rasulullah, oh Allah, isn't this going to ever end? Like every single day. So every single day. This is out of the compassion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When the Prophet came back to Medina, he said, these three, nobody can talk to them. And the situation got so difficult for them that they started to feel the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the people in Medina were never speaking to them. So much so now, even when they went to their own houses, their own wives would not speak to them anymore. Even their own wives would not speak to them. It reached a point where the Quran says they felt like the whole world was closing in on them. وَضَاقَتِ الْأَرْضُ بِمَا رَحُبَتْ. This earth that's so wide, it felt so tight. You know, sometimes when you're in a very difficult situation, the whole world with all of the width that it has, all the openness that it has, it feels extremely tight to you in those moments. It says, وَضَاقَتِ الْأَرْضُ بِمَا رَحُبَتْ. And it made it so difficult that finally these three came back to the Prophet. They said, Ya Rasulullah, we want to do tawbah. And what did the Prophet do? The Prophet accepted their tawbah. And sometimes Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put you and I through difficulties as well, just because He wants to get you back to this right path. And you and I will sit there and say, why? Why is this difficulty? I don't want to deal with this difficulty. I says, listen, you're missing the message. The message is, look at yourself. Maybe you're doing something wrong. And as we mentioned before, it's not always like that. Sometimes you're not doing anything wrong. Our imams also went through difficulty. They didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes this is the message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sending to us. This is the lesson to be learned from the three. The Quran says, وَعَلَى الثَّلَاثَةِ الَّذِينَ خُلِّفُوا. Those three that we left behind. We put them in a difficult situation until they came back. وَتَابَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمْ لِيَتُوبُوا. And then the Quran says, when they came back, إِنَّهُ بِهِمْ رَؤُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ. The moment they came back to Allah, Allah is the most forgiving. Allah is the kindest to them. But you have to come back first. You and I have to go back to the path of the Prophet first. Then when you go back, the moment you make that decision, I'm not going to commit this haram anymore. The moment you make the decision, I'm going to try to stick to this wajib of mine moving forward. Then you'll see the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You'll see the forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You automatically become beloved in His eyes. Recite a salawat, please. This came to an end. The benefits of Tabuk was that now even the Roman army would think twice before they were going to attack the Muslim areas, the areas under the Muslim Ummah. And this brought about a time for about a year or so where there were now multiple delegations from different tribes who used to come to the Prophet, and they used to essentially come to embrace the faith of Islam. So many tribes had already embraced after the conquest of Mecca, now even more, because now even the Roman army is thinking twice. People in the Arabian Peninsula said, listen, this is the country of Muhammad at this point. You have to be with him. And so many of them sent delegations. There's a number of delegations mentioned in history. Some of them were representing tribes. Some of them were representing individuals who were influential. They all came. Amongst these delegations that came, and this is the one I want to discuss, and inshallah we'll wrap up. This delegation that came was the delegation of the tribe of Thakif. Thakif is not going to ring a bell for you and I because we didn't discuss the tribe of Thakif, except when I tell you where Thakif used to live. Because this tribe of Thakif used to live in the city of Ta'if. That same Ta'if. That when the Prophet went to them early on, what happened? They threw stones at him. And they said, Muhammad, if you really have a God, He'll help you. Why do you need our help anyways? And the other one said, you know what? If you're the Prophet of God, I'll take the curtain of Mecca and I'll tear it up into pieces. Meaning, it's impossible. You're not even the messenger of God. This is the same Ta'if. Now they know that they have to accept the faith. Now they know they have to embrace the faith. How many years between when the Prophet went to Ta'if versus now these individuals are coming back? 10, 11 years now. 10, 11 years. But when the Prophet went to Ta'if, he had nobody. Now the Prophet has this whole Arabian Peninsula. And you know what's very interesting? This is the one lesson. It's very interesting is that none of these delegations who came did the Prophet ever tell them, those of them who were embracing the faith, the Prophet never told them, you remember what you did to me before? You remember when I came to you and you didn't accept me? You remember when you left me alone and I had nobody? You remember because you did this, now I'm going to take some revenge from you. The Prophet never sat there and said, oh, now you're going to join? Now that everything is done and everything is wonderful, now you're going to join? No, I'm not going to accept it. The Prophet never took this approach. When these people came, they're coming so late. The Prophet is going to leave this world in a year, year and a half. And his life is going to come to an end. And these people are coming in the 9th year after Hijrah, 10, 11 years after that incident of Ta'if has taken place. And the Prophet never said to any of these delegations, oh, why now? You know what he would say them? He used to tell them, hasn't the time come for you to embrace the faith? This is what he used to tell them. He used to tell them, oh, why now? Oh, you're late, so forget about it. Oh, all this time has passed. I needed your help then. I don't need you anymore. He never said this. This is the compassion of the Prophet. This is a heart that the Quran says, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. You have the best of characters. This is that heart that Musa was praying for. Muhammad already has this heart. Then he said, Rabbi shrah li sadri. Oh Allah, open my heart. The Prophet already has that heart. None of these delegations came, and the Prophet said, why now? It's too late, go back. No, he said, now, even now, the 11th hour, you've come to the right path. Wonderful, marhaban, welcome, come. This is such a big lesson from the life of the Prophet. The delegation of Thaqif came. They said, Muhammad, so even in the 11th hour, they still had that arrogance. Said, Muhammad, we've come. We know you're in charge now. We want to embrace the faith. But we have some conditions. We're like, what conditions? What are you talking about, conditions? It's over. What conditions? He said, no, we have some conditions. Prophet said, what's your condition? He said, our condition is that we'll embrace your faith, but for 3 years, you have to allow us to worship the idols. After the 3 years, we'll believe in you. And the Prophet said, no, that's not doable. And because they saw the rejection from the Prophet, they came back. They said, well, 6 months. We'll worship the idols for a number of months. And the Prophet said, listen, you don't understand. So how is this you're going to embrace the faith, but you're not embracing the faith at the same time? You're not worshiping these idols, but you're worshiping the idols at the same time. What does this mean? And then they saw how embarrassed they were in the presence of the Prophet. They said, no, we just said this because some of the people in our town wanted to do it this way. We didn't really mean it. We were speaking on their behalf. And then look at the flexibility of the Prophet. They said, okay, fine, Muhammad. We'll embrace the faith from right now. We won't worship the idols. And you can destroy the idols. Because this is what the Prophet used to do. He used to destroy the idols. Those tribes who used to embrace the faith, he would order, not just embrace the faith, you have to destroy this icon. The icons played a role in the message of the Prophet. So you have to destroy it. They said, okay, we'll embrace the faith. We will destroy these idols. But our only request is this. Instead of us taking the hammer and destroying the idols ourselves, can you send someone else? And you see the flexibility of the Prophet. He knows what to prioritize and what is not so important. He knows what's very important, where he needs to be firm, where he can be flexible. He said, that's fine. You don't want to ruin the idols with your own hands? I will send someone to ruin them. As long as Allah is worshipped. As long as you all embrace the faith. He knows when to be firm, when to be flexible. And so what did he do? He sent a couple of his people, including amongst them Abu Sufyan. And just the irony, huh? That now Abu Sufyan has to go there with his own hands, and he has to destroy the idols where? In this area of Taif. And amongst those other conditions that they put in front of the Prophet, and the Prophet also rejected, was this, and this one is a lesson for you and I. They said, Muhammad, we will embrace your faith, but just don't ask us to pray. We'll be Muslim, but this salat thing, and 5 times a day, and wudu, and all of this stuff. And the Prophet said no to that as well. Why? Because our religion comes as a package. You don't just choose. Say, I like this fasting thing. It's trendy. This other one, 5 times a day, the whole 365 days? No, forget about that one. This is not how the Prophet told us to practice the religion. Now, if someone fasts and they don't pray, that's still a good step. But the message is that you have to add this one, not be okay with where you are. And I can't be okay with where I am. This is not what the Prophet wanted for you and I. This is still good. This is why fasting is there. Because maybe this fasting opens your heart to something. Maybe it helps you then have your prayer. Maybe it helps you have your dress code. Maybe it helps you lower your gaze, whatever the case might be, with the other teachings that we have in Islam, yes? So this is not to say this person is bad. This is to say that this person can't be happy with this because this is not what the Prophet brought. The Prophet didn't bring a religion that, in my words, is a buffet. You're in a buffet, you decide, you choose. You like the nahari, you like the, what do we have for dinner tonight? I don't know what we have for dinner. You like the pizza, you like the pasta, you like whatever you like. And there's no problem. You take from this one, you take from that one. I like spicy food myself. It's no problem. But Islam's not a buffet. Islam is a package. And if you take something away from this package, it's not going to run. It's like a car. And someone might say, well, in a car, an engine is more important than the wheels and the tires. But guess what? Even if you have the best engine, can the car run? The car can't run. Yes, some things in Islam are more important than other things. But without the whole package, you're not going to be able to make your way towards Allah. You can have all the gas in the world, but if your tire's not working, can you go anywhere? No. There are hierarchy of rulings in Islam. Yes, salat is a lot more important than a lot of other rulings. But unless you're doing all of the rulings, then you're going to fail. Then you're not going to be able to make your way towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This religion of ours is not a buffet. Unlike hopefully the dinner we're going to have tonight or whatever. I don't know, it's not a buffet. But, hopefully, inshallah, one day. With that, inshallah, we'll bring tonight's talk to an end. Let us take a moment to recite Surah Al-Fatiha for all of your marhumin and marhumat, especially the marhumin and marhumat of the sponsors of tonight's program. Before we do that, let us take a moment to recite a couple salawats for those who are happy to have gained a deeper understanding of the life of the Prophet. Recite a salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa Muhammad. For those who are happy that this was the last lecture, recite a salawat. We got a couple here. For those who have a newfound love for the Prophet, when they recite salawat, they feel that new love. Recite a salawat. Let's recite Surah Al-Fatiha for all of your marhumin and marhumat. As the sponsors of tonight's program, the marhumin and marhumat of the sponsors of all of the programs, the marhumin, marhumat of all of those who worked so hard during this month of Ramadan. I cannot tell you, brothers and sisters, how much work and effort went into this. A special, dua for our youth who stepped up and were helping every single day with the food and with the cleaning and the organization and everything that was happening. All of the volunteers, all of those who pitched in financially, they pitched in with their time, they pitched in with their efforts. Every single person who worked hard to make these lectures a reality. We are only, someone like me, I can only sit here and benefit from these gatherings. And we only ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward them, because you and I could never be able to reward them. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can reward them. Let's take a moment to recite Surah Al-Fatiha for all of their marhumin and marhumat with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.
Jazakallah Shaykh. And inshallah, we are about to start our festivities for the night. We will be moving the partitions away, and we will have the stalls set up here, and then we'll begin our festivities, inshallah. Just a quick note, we're changing things tonight. Inshallah, we're expecting a large number of guests. So near the time of Salat, inshallah, I would like to request all brothers to please make their way out the exit down the hallway with your shoes on outside, because our prayer area is set up outside, and our food, inshallah, our iftar will also be broken outside, inshallah. So this entire area, because we're going to move the partition away, the sisters will be praying here. So this area will be off limits. So that is just the announcement for tonight. And without further ado, inshallah, let us begin with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil.